Harold Keith Johnny Johnson was Chief of Staff of the United States Army from 1964 to 1968. Regarded as a premier tactician, Johnson became skeptical that the level of resources given to the Vietnam War, much of which went into find, fix, and destroy the big main force units operations, could deliver victory. Johnson came to believe that the Communist forces held a trump card, because they controlled whether there were engagements with U.S. forces, giving an option to simply avoid battle with U.S. forces if the situation warranted it. As Johnson saw it, the main force and NVA units would always keep the casualties below what they considered a prohibitive level, and could not be swept away by U.S. firepower. He did, however, acknowledge that Commander William Westmoreland had little choice but to engage the enemy's main formations, which had to be prevented from securing base areas where they could concentrate. Johnson was instrumental in altering the focus to a counterinsurgency approach, but was frustrated at the U.S. government refusal to provide the manpower necessary for successful pacification. In his later years, Johnson said it had been obvious that U.S. national mobilization was required to win in Vietnam, and he regretted not resigning in protest at the government asking the Army to fight a war without hope of ultimate victory. Early career in World War II. Harold Keith Johnson was born in Bosemont, North Dakota on February 22, 1912. After graduation from high school in 1929, Johnson attended the United States Military Academy, West Point, New York. On June 13, 1933, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry. Johnson's first duty assignment was with the 3rd Infantry at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. In 1938, Johnson attended infantry school in Fort Benning. Upon graduation, he was assigned to the 28th Infantry at Fort Niagara, New York. Requesting overseas transfer, Johnson was reassigned to the 57th Infantry at Fort McKinley, Philippine Islands in 1940. After the fall of Bataan, Johnson became a prisoner of the Japanese on the 9th of April 1942. Participating in the Bataan Death March, Johnson was eventually imprisoned at Camp O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, and Bilibid Prison. In December 1944, the Japanese attempted to transfer Johnson and 1,600 other POWs out of the Philippines. On the 14th of December 1944, American fighter planes sunk the Japanese ship the Oryoku Maru, killing over 300 of the POWs. Johnson survived and was eventually transferred to Japan. Unwilling to give up the POWs to the advancing Allies, Japan again transferred Johnson, finally ending up in Korea. Johnson was liberated by the 7th Infantry Division on September 7, 1945. Post-World War II. After Johnson's return to the United States, his first assignment was with the Ground Forces School Tour. In August 1946, he attended the Commander NAMP General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he remained as an instructor for another 2 years. Johnson next attended the Armed Forces Staff College in Norfolk, Virginia in 1949. After graduation, he was assigned as commanding officer, 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. Johnson organized the 1st Provisional I Infantry Battalion at Fort Devens, and in August 1950, he was dispatched to Korea. The battalion became the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division for the defense of the Pusan perimeter. Still with the 1st Cavalry Division, Johnson was later promoted to command the 5th and the 8th Cavalry Regiments. In February 1951, he was reassigned as Assistant Chief of Staff, G3 of 1st Corps. Returning to the United States, Johnson was assigned to the office of the Chief of the Army Field Forces, Fort Monroe, Virginia. In 1952, he attended the National War College. After graduation, Johnson was assigned to the office of the Assistant Chief of Staff, G3, where he served first as Chief of Joint War Plans Branch, then as the Assistant to the Chief of the Plans Division, and finally as the Executive Officer of the Assistant Chief of Staff. In January 1956, Johnson was assigned to duty as Assistant Division Commander of the 8th Infantry Division at Fort Carson, Colorado. Later in 1956, he transferred with the 8th Division to Germany. Johnson's next assignment was as Chief of Staff, 7th Army Headquarters at Stuttgart-Vaihingen. Then in April 1959, Johnson moved to Headquarters, United States Army, Europe, as Assistant Chief of Staff, G3. The following December, he was appointed Chief of Staff, Central Army Group at NATO headquarters, concerned with planning for the employment of French, German, and American troop operations in Central Europe. Returning to the United States, Johnson was assigned as Commandant, Commandant General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In February 1963, he became Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Military Operations Department of the Army, and in July was appointed as Deputy Chief of Staff for Military Operations. On July 3, 1964, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Chief of Staff. Johnson was appointed the 24th Chief of Staff of the United States Army. His reputation as an expert tactician led to him being selected over candidates with more seniority. He had told the National Guard Association that year that military force should be committed with the object beyond war in mind, and, broadly speaking, the object beyond war should be the restoration of stability with the minimum of destruction, so that society and lawful government may proceed in an atmosphere of justice and order. Vietnam War. Johnson went to Vietnam in December 1965 after the Battle of Iowa Drang. He concluded that it had not been a victory at all and that Westmoreland's big unit strategy was misconceived. However, Johnson publicly said there was no alternative to disrupting enemy main force units in the Central Highlands, as preventing them establishing base areas in the Middle Country was essential. After talking to junior officers involved in the first major actions, Johnson concluded that enemy main force units had the ability to evade engagements, giving them the option keep casualties below an acceptable level. But they were in fact accepting the actual kill ratios being achieved, as evidenced by them attacking U.S. forces. Johnson started the process to have Westmoreland replaced in Vietnam, and commissioned a PROVN study, which noted that aerial attacks and artillery fire, applied indiscriminately, also have exacted a toll on village allegiance. There was a deep-seated reluctance among the Joint Chiefs to interfere with the command decisions of Westmoreland. However, harassing artillery fire, by U.S. forces at least, was greatly reduced. Conditions for enlisted personnel. As Chief of Staff, one of Johnson's noteworthy accomplishments was creating the office of the Sergeant Major of the Army to improve the quality of life for enlisted personnel. He selected Sergeant Major William O. Woolridge to be the first to hold this post. Johnson also served as acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a few months in 1967 during the convalescence of General Earl Wheeler. Johnson retired from active duty in July 1968. For 3 years later, General Johnson headed the Freedom Foundation at Valley Forge and afterwards worked as a banking executive until retiring for good. Final years. Johnson married Dorothy Renix in 1935. During his term as Chief of Staff, had been involved in many policy debates regarding the escalation of the Vietnam War as a proponent of full military mobilization to achieve a pacification of South Vietnam. He considered resigning in protest over President Lyndon B. Johnson's decision not to mobilize the reserves, and at the end of his life expressed regret at not doing so. He was the subject of a biography, Honorable Warrior, by Louis Sorley. He died September 24, 1983, in Washington, D.C. Tributes. He had an unusual sense of loyalty to the men under him, the kind of thing ordinary soldiers notice and value when they grade an officer. He was the best, someone born to lead men. I think he was always thinking about what was good for us. Nothing ever got by him. Military career chronology. 1933, graduated from the United States Military Academy. 1933 to 1937, commissioned a second lieutenant and assigned to the 3D Infantry at Fort Snelling. 1936, promoted to first lieutenant. 1938, graduated from the infantry school at Fort Benning. 1938 to 1940, served in the 28th Infantry at Fort Niagara. 1940, assigned to the 57th Infantry, Philippine Scouts, at Fort McKinley. 1940, promoted to temporary rank of captain. 1941, promoted to temporary rank of major. 1942, promoted to temporary rank of lieutenant colonel. 1943, promoted to permanent rank of captain. 1942 to 1945, was a battalion commander in the defense of the Philippines, was taken prisoner when Bataan fell, survived the Bataan Death March and imprisonment in the Philippines, Japan, and Korea, and was liberated by the 7th Infantry Division. 1945, promoted to temporary colonel. 1947 to 1949, instructor at Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. 1950, commanded the 3D Battalion, 7th Infantry, at Fort Devens. 1950, 1951, battalion commander and commander of both the 5th and 8th Cavalry in Korean War operations. 1951, plans and operations officer of the 1st Corps, Far East Command. 1952, plans and operations officer in the Office of the Chief of Army Field Forces at Fort Monroe. 1953, graduated from the National War College. 1955, Chief of the Joint War Plans Branch, Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff, G3. 1956, Executive Officer in the Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff, G3. 1956, promoted to temporary brigadier general. 1956, promoted to permanent colonel. 1957, assistant division commander of the 8th Infantry Division. 1957 to 1959, chief of staff of the 7th Army in Germany. 1959, promoted to temporary major general. 1960, chief of staff of the Central Army Group North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 1960, promoted to permanent brigadier general. 1960 to 1963, commandant of the Command and General Staff College. 1963, assistant and then acting deputy chief of staff for military operations. 1963, promoted to permanent major general. 1963, promoted to temporary lieutenant general. 1963 – 1964, Deputy Chief of Staff for Military Operations, 1964, promoted to Temporary General. July 3, 1964 – July 2, 1968, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, 1968, retired from active service. Decorations and medals. Combat Infantryman Badge, 2 awards. Distinguished Service Cross, Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, Legion of Merit with 3 Oak Leaf Clusters. Bronze Star, Army Presidential Unit Citation with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters. Prisoner of War Medal, American Defense Service Medal with 1 Bronze Service Star. Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 4 Campaign Stars. World War II Victory Medal, National Defense Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. Korean Service Medal with 6 Campaign Stars. Samuel Medal, Philippines Presidential Unit Citation, South Korean Presidential Unit Citation. Philippine Defense Medal, Philippine Liberation Medal with Star, United Nations Career Medal. General Johnson was posthumously eligible for the Prisoner of War Medal when it was created in 1986.